Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome this Thursday morning to Everything Cooperative. My name is Vernon Oakes. Would you believe it's been a year? It's been 1 year since we started the program last year, celebrating Cooperative Month. And on our program, starting off was with David Thompson, who's the person that's on the line today. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Vernon. How are you today?
Thank you. Thanks for coming on and celebrating our first anniversary of Everything Cooperative.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to start off with today in Co-op Month.
And it's a little bit early out in California, isn't it?
Well, unfortunately it is, yeah.
Okay. So glad you came on for a couple of reasons here. You know, I said last year, and I'm going to start again this year with the statement that the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the 50s and 60s would not have existed without the knowledge gained from the cooperative movement. At least it would not have happened the way we knew it to happen, or it would not have been as successful without the knowledge gained. As a matter of fact, we could even take this back to the 1850s with Frederick Douglass or the 1920s with W.E.B. Du Bois. What do you think about that statement, that the civil rights movement would not have happened without what was learned in the co-op movement?
Well, I think that without a doubt, unknowingly, most people would not understand the role that cooperatives have played in the civil rights movement. And a number of people that are critical to it got their knowledge of a great deal of the efforts that they were doing through the cooperatives. And Frederick Douglass, I think, is one of the best examples. I'm still counting the numbers, but I believe that Frederick Douglass was in Rochdale, which is where the cooperative movement began in England in 1844. Douglass was there, I think, 5 times in 1846. And one of the things that was going on in England, and certainly Rochdale was a key part of that at the time, was how to get votes for ordinary working people. And of course, in those days, we're only talking about males, attempting to get the vote. But if you didn't have property, you could not vote in the British elections. And there was a movement called Chartism, which was a very strong effort prior to the labor movement of getting the vote for people by buying land collectively and then parceling out that land in little bits to give each of the members a vote. And Rochdale was one of the centers of that movement, and the cooperators were an integral part of that activity. And Douglass is supposed to have gone off to one of the cooperative communities to see what happens when people put their money together, buy land together, and then have cooperative ownership of land, but individual ownership, which gave them the right to vote. And that had a tremendous impact upon Douglass because he was exiled to England because people were looking for him because he was still a slave at the time. And off he went to England, and in the almost 2 years that he was there, he learned a lot about the cooperative sector.
But I'm going to go all the way back to make sure I understand and the audience understands. So, in the 1800s, you couldn't vote in England unless you owned land.
Correct.
Okay, so this wasn't a race thing; it's more an economic thing. So that when you vote to have a say of what goes on and who gets elected. So
Right.
It's a fundamental democratic principle.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to be wealthy to own land. And so the
Mm-hmm.
common person that didn't have money couldn't vote.
Correct.
So it's not race, it's money.
Mm-hmm.
That separates the voters and the non-voters. Okay.
Right.
And the reason I'm bringing this up because voting is happening here in D.C. the first week of November, and there's voter registration going on now, and too many people take it for granted, this thing to vote. But white folks in England couldn't vote unless you had money in the 1800s.
Correct.
And you were going about, the cooperators were going about buying land and then putting little parcels together. Parcels, what is a parcel? A square foot of land?
Well, no. In this case, the Chartists ended up buying thousands and thousands of acres of land.
Oh.
The interest by working people in getting the vote was so high that people were willing to invest a substantial amount of their own money to be able to participate in one of these land cooperatives.
Okay, so you had the land cooperative, and then the people in the land are members of this cooperative. Mm-hmm. Then they could get a piece and they could vote.
Right.
So I really wanted to put in a plug for people to get out and get registered to vote and make sure you vote. I think it's November 5th, mayoral elections. Okay. So Frederick Douglass, a slave, goes to England 4 or 5 times, and he learns about this cooperative movement in Rochdale.
Right. Well, what he did, he went to England in 1845 and came back to the United States in 1847. And during that period, he appears to have spoken in Rochdale 5 different times.
Okay.
And the audience that he would speak to would be, in many cases, the members of the cooperative, the Rochdale Pioneers Cooperative, because of those members, almost all of them had shares in a Chartist land cooperative. I think I counted about 11 of the 28 members of the first co-op all had shares in a Chartist land cooperative.
And that's what gave them the right to vote.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. But the other thing, I think we covered it a little bit last time, but of course there could be different people up at this time of day.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the champions of the cooperative in Rochdale was a man called John Bright, who was a Quaker. And Frederick Douglass stayed with John Bright every time that he went to Rochdale. And one of the things that John Bright realized is that he and other Quakers could participate in the purchase of Frederick Douglass as a slave. And so Frederick Douglass arrived in Rochdale as a slave. I think the first time he arrived there was about October of 1846. The effort to purchase his slavery went on, and by December of that year, the Quakers of Britain had purchased the freedom of Frederick Douglass. And so when he last left Rochdale, I think in December that year, he was, for the first time in his life, a free man. And that freedom had been, a third of that freedom had been purchased by John Bright of Rochdale. So Frederick Douglass, his freedom is closely associated with his visits to Rochdale.
So they bought him first as a slave. They
Correct.
Put their money together, and John Bright, 1/3 of whatever the fee was.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Do you have any idea what that cost?
Well, of course, that was 1846.
Mm-hmm.
And I would need to look it up. But I think, let me see, what I did at one point was to try to translate that into today's dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And the number comes to around about $30,000 in today's money.
So he would have put up about $10,000, which is no small amount of money. That's what I was trying to get to.
Yeah, in those days.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so they bought Frederick Douglass for approximately $30,000 in today's dollars, and they set him free.
They did. Yeah. And one of the things in the book that I'm writing, The Role of Cooperatives in the Civil Rights Movement, in February of this year, I was in Manchester, which is only about 12 miles away from Rochdale. And in Manchester, I'd been plodding through all of these books and documents, etc. But there was a letter that Frederick Douglass wrote back to somebody in the United States who was opposed to his freedom being bought. And Douglass wrote a letter to him saying what freedom meant to him, and it's a fabulous, fabulous letter that I think, should go into the annals of civil rights history. But I found there was an address on the letter that Frederick Douglass, when he sent his letter, had his own address on. And I found that address in Manchester, and I stood in front of that building, which still exists, and looked at it, and I thought to myself, my God, Frederick Douglass was in this building when he received a letter saying that he was a free man. And can you imagine what that must have meant?
I can only imagine it. But even my imagination, I don't think, can go as far as it would have meant for him, because what does it mean to be a slave?
Right.
It's hard to even grasp.
And he covers that all in his letter. So, and he probably went over to see John Bright and tell him that everything had happened, the sale had gone on, and his freedom was now bought. And I'm sure that there was a lot that he would never ever forget about Rochdale.
Going back to the premise that I started with, is that the civil rights movement would not have happened, or would not have happened the way it did without cooperative movement. It's just in 1946 or 47, 48, that if Frederick Douglass' freedom wasn't bought, then he would not have been able to go around speaking as he was able to do in the U.S. So there alone, the cooperatives had a huge part in setting him free, but also his training about cooperatives and working together. It's fascinating. I would it's to be in front of that building that still exists today. That's also amazing, because so many things here in the U.S. gets torn down after 50 years and rebuilt, that something is still, 160 years later, 170 years later, still the building's still there. Right.
Well, I'm part of what I'm going to do when I have a little bit of time is approach the city of Manchester, which has a tremendous relationship to the cooperative movement, but I want to get them to put a plaque on the building which would state that it was in this building that Frederick Douglass received the news that he was a free man.
And with that, receiving that news, we're going to pause for a quick break. If anyone out there would like a comment to David or myself, or a question, please call in at 1-800-450-7876. That's 1-800-450-7876. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Vernon Oaks, talking to David Thompson about everything cooperative. David, I just got a call in that somebody told us that the election is on November the 4th in D.C. and not November the 5th. So please go out and vote. the first week of November. That's November the 4th. But I'd also like to tell you that this coming Saturday, we have a couple things here in the D.C. area. The second annual D.C. Cooperative Clinic is this coming Saturday, October the 4th, from 8:30 to 3:30. It's free. They have free breakfast and lunch. And that's at 3047 15th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. Come out and learn about cooperatives. If you belong to a co-op, you can come out and participate. And even if you don't and you want to get more information, come on out this coming Saturday from 8:30 to 3:30. Everything is free, food and knowledge. And on October, the same day, they have the Co-op 5K Run, which CDF, the Cooperative Development Foundation, is hosting. And that's at Haynes Point, starting at 8 o'clock. I'll be there, so come on out. You sign up at 7 o'clock, give away prizes starting at 9:30. I figured it'll take me about an hour to walk 3.1 miles. So come on out and join us. And then I'm going to the clinic. So, David, let's go back to, let's talk about the 1950s with Thurgood Marshall.
Can I, if you don't mind, in the break, I went online to look at something because I was interested. Mm-hmm. So this is just one last point relative to Frederick Douglass. When he returned to the United States in 1847, one of the things that he did was to join the Northampton Association, which was a kind of a commune run cooperatively in Northampton, Massachusetts. And he lived there for quite a while. But one of the other members of that commune was Sojourner Truth. Mm. And that association was, in essence, practicing a lot of the elements of what had been learned from the Chartist communities in Britain. And I'm just beginning to learn about it. It's something that I was brought to just recently, and I'm giving a talk in Northampton, and the manager at the co-op there wrote to me and said, by the way, do you know about the Northampton Association? So it's really amazing how history unveils itself in front of yourself.
And when are you giving that talk?
I'm giving that talk October. I forget the date at this point, but October the 19th, I think, in Northampton, Massachusetts.
If you let me know, I'd like to perhaps even come up.
Oh, okay. Well, I will certainly do that. And that is the town where David Ruggles spent quite a lot of his life.
Okay.
But anyhow, that's
Okay. I would like to, I know Roger Wilcox is up in that area and quite a few other people. Let them know and see if some other people would like to come up. But what I started to ask you about, if you go to the 1930s and 50s, you get Thurgood Marshall and his role with co-ops. Can you give us a little insight on that?
Well, it's funny how as you do these things, you suddenly realize as you study people like Thurgood Marshall how important various things were in his life. But when he got hired to be the second lawyer working for the NAACP in New York City, he moved from Baltimore with his wife. And one of the things that happened was that to supplement his paltry income as a lawyer for the NAACP, he and his wife took up the job of delivering groceries for a consumer cooperative in New York that had been started by Ella Baker. And there they were.
Ella Jo Baker?
Yeah, okay. Right. And there they were, delivering groceries at nighttime, probably after they came home from their work. And, now we have delivery systems that we think are all kind of new, but, there is Thurgood Marshall and his wife doing that for the co-op that they were a part of, to help them reduce their cost of food. But the critical factor for Thurgood Marshall was that his first wife regretfully died of some complicated illnesses. And a little later, he was to marry again. But in this case, he married a woman of Filipino-Hawaiian blood. And it was so difficult in New York to own real estate for blacks. But blacks who were in interracial marriages had even a worse time, because an interracial marriage was always thought of that must be a black and a white, and so we must stop that. And so we have these laws against interracial marriages. He was in an interracial marriage, but of course he hadn't married a white person. But there, the law, stood out. But Morningside Gardens, a cooperative that was being developed in New York by Columbia University with the help of the Rockefeller family, was created to be an interracial cooperative. And it was one of the first to come out that way. And they knew of the troubles that Douglass was having because he couldn't
Marshall.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thurgood Marshall was having. Okay.
Right. They knew of the troubles that he was having, and invited him to be one of the early members of the Morningside Co-op. So he and his wife, and at that point they had one child. Or I think the child was actually born at Morningside. Anyhow, they moved into a fresh, new apartment that had never had a person in it before. And because it was a cooperative and they owned a piece of everything, then they had a shareholding in the co-op, and they had ownership, and they had the ability to deduct, like everybody else, all of the mortgage interest, et cetera. And for the first time in his life, and this was now, he was in his 50s, Thurgood Marshall, who fought to get every kid to be able to go to any school in America, Thurgood Marshall had ownership of his first home, a home that he couldn't buy anywhere in New York City except through a co-op.
When you think of Thurgood Marshall, from my knowledge of him, he was always, by the time I knew of him, he was Supreme Court Justice. I knew about him a little bit before that, but you'd never think of him as poverty or struggling, going to school here at Howard University, graduating, and then, having his own firm and not making very much money. And I think when he went to NAACP, according to an article I read that you wrote, he was making $2,400 a year.
Right. That was it. Yeah.
$2,400 a year.
Right.
So I see how they had to work for the co-op to get either, cheaper food. Being in a co-op, normally the products are less costly because there's no profit motive and people work in there to keep the labor costs down.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I just sort of expand from this a little bit. I've been sort of tracing people down, but, if you look at the civil rights movement and you just look at New York City, there is Thurgood Marshall joining in, 1960-something. You have A. Philip Randolph joining the Dunbar Co-op in the 1930s. You have Bayard Rustin living at Penn South Co-op in the 1960s. James Farmer of Core lived in a co-op in the village. Roy Wilkins lived in one place that was becoming a co-op just as he passed away. But the fact that they all were living in co-ops because that was the one place that wouldn't turn them away, that would allow them to live there, that wouldn't practice discrimination against them. These were all, co-ops, created by public-minded people. and they all had a limited equity bent to them so that they would be affordable housing forever. But if you can imagine that all of these people with such great careers and Presidential Medal of Freedom winners, etc., but the only place that would give them a home was a housing co-op in New York City.
Fascinating. And it really blows my mind to think that you could not buy a place. It seems to be so common now, just like you have the ability to vote, but it wasn't common back then.
Mm-hmm.
And that we take things for granted that people had to fight and die to give us the ability to buy in a home wherever you want if you have the funds to pay for it. It's also amazing to me that co-op housing was one of the first places that you could buy a house
Mm-hmm.
here in the U.S. A black could buy a house.
Right.
Well,
when I think of co-op housing, I think not only of all of its economic values, but I certainly do think that giving people a home, giving them a roof over their head, letting them know that whatever it was that they wear, either black or gay or ex-communist or whatever it may be.
Hold it. We're going to come right back to that. I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say, but we've got to step right away. We'll be right back, Dave.
1450 WOL.
Again, this is Vernon Oaks. This bright Thursday morning. We have David Thompson as our guest on the line. And the National Cooperative Bank is sponsoring this program to tell you the benefits of cooperatives. NCB's customers are cooperatives such as grocery wholesaler co-ops, purchasing co-ops, housing co-ops. Other customers share in the spirit of cooperation, driven by democratic organizing principles. They may be Alaska or Native American enterprises, which by their very nature are member-run and member-owned. So NCB wants us to know about cooperatives and the benefits. And David is telling us that this goes all the way back to the 1850s in the Civil Rights Movement with Frederick Douglass, and we've talked about Thurgood Marshall. And he was just getting ready to tell us about housing co-ops, that they're not only economically valued, but tell us what else you were saying, David.
Well, I think for me one of the more wonderful stories about the role of civil rights is how people could get a roof over their head. It's always very hard for us to know what that means to people, because it means safety, it means a community, it means a place you can grow up without, feeling hate or being turfed out by your landlord because you are organizing for a better life for people, better wages for people, anti-discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. But the cooperatives, played a very, very large role in protecting a lot of the civil rights activists. And one of the things that comes to mind when that I'm writing about here is after the Second World War, there was a very changed attitude about race in America. And on the one hand, there was, more overt racism that was happening in the South. But on the other hand, there were the efforts by many, many people in the North and in the West to say, look, we died together, we fought together in the trenches, we won a war together, and yet when I come home, I cannot be in the same community as you because I am black and you are white, Mm-hmm. So a great number of housing cooperatives were set up by interracial groups in the 1950s to provide a community where they both could live together. And when those groups went to the FHA to get insurance for their loans, the FHA would turn them down one after the other. And the argument that the FHA would make was that if this housing co-op accepted blacks, then lots of other white people wouldn't want to live there, and therefore our asset is going to be greatly harmed, and therefore on economic grounds, we are not going to make a loan to a co-op that accepts a member who is black. And that all of that is written down. All of that is in documentation. There were groups in California and LA that set up a 500-home mutual housing organization in West LA that some of my relatives-in-law were a part of founding. There was one in Illinois in particular that went to Thurgood Marshall and asked him to be their lawyer on the basis of, if you really want to break down housing discrimination, here is a place where we want to do it together and we're not being allowed to. So Thurgood Marshall became their lawyer, and he ended up putting onto the desk of President Truman a synopsis of all of the efforts being made to desegregate housing by cooperatives throughout the United States. And eventually, Harry Truman turned around and he issued an executive order that the FHA had to stop discriminating against the borrowers. And you know, that was the beginning of the FHA making changes in the way that it did its lending. But those changes actually took a lot longer than just the executive order from Harry Truman. Regretfully, they took a much longer time to take place.
You know, it's sad that when you look at the U.S. government and how it perpetuated discrimination, guys, there's economics, and the FHA saying that the multifamily asset would go down in value if blacks moved.
Mm-hmm.
That's sad. And Roger Wilcox, I mentioned his name earlier just for the folks out there. He's a 94-year-old white man that in 1944 created a co-op in Connecticut, and he had the same problem with FHA. They wanted blacks in. They wanted a co-op that represented the community with everybody that lived in there, and the FHA would not give them loans. And they said that even to the day, they never got an FHA loan. They found out how to do it, how to create their co-op and get funding without the FHA loan. Mm-hmm. But that is very, very sad. Yeah.
I was reading the other day a comment by Mr. Levitt, who was the founder of Levittown, which was, is regarded by many as the first suburb in America. And there were no blacks allowed to live in Levittown. And the place had a population of 30 to 40,000 people. And he said, if I sold one house to one black, I wouldn't be able to sell any more houses to any whites. And he just said that, mm-hmm. It's documented. But the cooperatives took the opposite perspective, which is that we want to build a multiracial society. That is the America of the future. That is the America that we fought for. How can we talk about fighting for democracy and then when we come home not allow democracy to happen? So I think it was a very proud chapter. Too many housing cooperatives actually folded because they couldn't get the money through FHA, and the only way that FHA would eventually lend money was if they adopted a a proviso that they would not sell to blacks, and put that into the documents for each of the units. And some of the blacks and some of those cooperatives wrote back to the board and said, "Look, we want the cooperative to happen. We know it is never going to happen if we are members, so we are going to withdraw our membership because otherwise you're never going to have the cooperative."
That's very sad. Very sad.
Yeah, you can imagine giving up a dream, but still wanting others to have it. That generosity of spirit, was amazing. But the fact that the co-op, would only be able to continue, by going to FHA and saying, well, the black members have withdrawn, we will put in that proviso. That was a terrible thing for the co-op to do itself.
Chuck Snyder, who's the president of National Co-op Banks, on the program said that co-ops are people helping people. That fundamentally, to me, is the definition of any co-op, whether it is a consumer co-op like a housing co-op, or whether it is a worker co-op where the people that work in the co-op own the business. It's just people helping people, solving community problems.
Right.
But it's sad to think that in the early 40s, 50s, 60s, perhaps, that the FHA, that blacks had to get out of the co-op to help the whites. That's sad. Yeah. That's another example, people helping people.
Right. And as you mentioned, NCB, National Cooperative Bank, one of the wonderful things is that almost all of these co-ops that I'm talking about in my book that, did this fight against segregation, they are now the banker for almost all of those co-ops. So, the co-op got to exist, the co-op got to house people of different races and religions, and there is the National Cooperative Bank providing the funding to them without asking them, do you allow black people to live here?
Okay. I heard Congressman Keith Ellison speak of housing as he compared it to a bowl. You need a bowl to make a cake. He said, try to put eggs in if you don't have the bowl, try to put eggs and flour and sugar and butter and whatever and try to make a cake. You just put it on a flat piece. You can't make the cake. He said a house is the same way for a family. Without a house, without a unit, without somewhere to, you can't raise children. There's no place for them to feel safe and secure, and nowhere for them to do their homework or eat together. To create the sort of the bond that you need for a family. So that's why housing is so very important in a family or in the life of a community. Right.
Can I talk a little bit about sort of the growth of civil rights, because it started off, sort of addressing the needs of blacks, but there was an interesting intersection in the life of Bayard Rustin, who got his first and only chance to own a home was to own a share in the Penn South Co-op in New York City, and he lived there for about 30 years, and he died there.
Would you tell people who Bayard Rustin is in case somebody out there don't know?
Yeah, right. Well, he is somewhat unknown, which is always, it's just as amazing to me. But Bayard Rustin was the gentleman who was the organizer of the March on Washington. He was the one who put every little piece of his capacity to work to organize a March on Washington, to organize, 250,000 or more people to be there, to organize all of the buses to get the people there, to organize all of the security to make sure that nothing happened that would, leave a mark upon what was going on. And he has played a role, he is now passed away, but he has played a role in so much of the civil rights movement in the United States. He went down to Little Rock and assisted the Little Rock Nine. He went down to Montgomery to help Martin Luther King. His name pops up, but he was a man who was a very trusted advisor. But he was also a Quaker, and was a leader in the nonviolent movement. But also he was gay. And he had his partner, who is still alive and who still lives at Penn South. But his partner in life, because he was gay, they couldn't, under the New York laws, Bayard Rustin couldn't leave the apartment to him because he wasn't related. And what eventually happened is that Bayard Rustin adopted his partner, whose name is Walter Nagel, who's written quite a lot about Bayard's life because he lived much of it.
All right, David, we got to take another break. Sorry
Sure.
about it. We'll be right back. WOL, information is power. National Cooperative Bank is giving you information about cooperatives and how they function, the benefits of them, how they work, democratically controlled, member-owned. Cooperatives can be any form of business. And today we have David Thompson talking to us from California. And when we took break, David, I was so engrossed in what you were saying, I forgot that we had to go on a break. So I'm sorry for that quick stop. But you were telling us about Bayard Rustin, who lived from 1912 to 1987, and the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. You want to continue telling us about him?
Right. Well, as I was saying, he had a partner, Walter Nagel. They had an extremely long relationship through much of this time period. And Walter is still alive and living at Penn South in the same apartment today. But, from the point of view of civil rights, there was no way or mechanism that Bayard could leave his share in the co-op to his partner because they were gay. And eventually Bayard figured out that he would adopt his partner as his son. And by adopting him as a son, which of course the state couldn't care less about, then Bayard was able to, in his will, leave the apartment to his adopted son. And that was the way in which they got around the anti-gay legislation that was, in existence in New York at that time. And it's only recently that Bayard, under laws, would be able to leave the apartment to his partner. So that was, a growth of the civil rights movement, where he as a black person couldn't normally own anything, but could because it was a co-op, and yet because he was gay, he couldn't leave that place to his partner.
I would assume that the reason we don't know much about Bayard Rustin is because he was gay. Is that right?
It's very possible. He, a lot of people would say, well, he was an anti-war activist. That didn't go down very well. He was a pacifist, which was even worse. He, in his youth, had been a communist, so that was terrible. Oh. And on top of that, he was a Quaker, and then people found out he was gay. So, it's amazing that, he had to work against all of these different stigmas that society had upon him. But he seemed to decided that he was going to do whatever he needed to do to build a better society, and it really didn't matter to him what people thought of him. What mattered was what he achieved, and he is, to me, is one of the great unsung heroes of the civil rights movement because. Roy Wilkins didn't want him to be organizing the March on Washington because he was gay and an ex-communist, and that might come out. And it actually did. But, there was Bayard Rustin going to work every day at an office in Harlem to organize the March on Washington. And he was coming backwards and forwards from his co-op apartment where he felt safe as houses during that entire whole time.
History is so fascinating. I'm glad you're doing this book. We're in our last segment. The hour's almost gone. It goes by very quickly. Any other things that you want to talk about, or any lessons that you're learning as you're writing and studying this book?
Well, I think without a doubt, Vernon, one of the things that's popping out all over the place is the role of women in the civil rights movement. And Ella Baker and Septima Clark from South Carolina, who was the first organizer of the citizenship schools, which was organized in the back of a little co-op on St. Helena Island St. John's Island in the Sea Islands in South Carolina. They both attribute their ability to have an important role in the civil rights movement to their start in cooperatives. That because the cooperative had a focus on democratic rights for everybody, equal rights for everybody, equal say in what the cooperative could do. In particular, Ella Baker carried that idea through the rest of her life in all of the organizations that she worked with. And she was the first staff person for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She was the first staff person for SNCC. But she always really, really fought for democracy to be observed and to be honored and for people to have a say and to have a voice. So I think that, those cooperatives that Ella Baker organized in Harlem, where she learned a lot about the cooperatives, where she participated in a number of seminars given by National Cooperative Business Association, which in those days was called CLUSA, the Cooperative League of the USA. CLUSA did a series of workshops for black cooperators to teach them all about Rochdale. And one of Ella Baker's mentors, George Schuyler, he actually went to Manchester and also to Rochdale in the 1940s to learn how Rochdale really started. So the ties between the cooperatives and the civil rights movement were always strong, but they were everyday ties. They were the ties, that came about through the service of the cooperative to everybody. Bob Moses, who was one of the great organizers and still is living today, of the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, his first memory of a cooperative was working in one of the cooperatives that Ella Baker had organized, which was a milk cooperative in New York, and they delivered huge vats of milk to each of these housing communities, low-income housing communities, and people like Bob Moses and the young people would ladle out the milk into everybody's dishes and bowls, or as you might say. Mm-hmm. And that was the cooperative that first played a role in his life. But the role of women definitely is a critical one in all of this, and I'm really enjoying being able to highlight that contribution.
You know, I'm talking about going up to hear you speak in Massachusetts on October the 19th.
Yeah, the 22nd. Sorry, it's the 22nd I checked.
Okay, the 22nd.
Right. Yeah.
The last time you were on the show, we talked about, or we threatened to get together and go down to visit the Highlander School, is where they taught the citizenship classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fifth principle of the cooperative, which you talked about Rochdale, is education, training, and information. And that one of the things I like about co-ops, and there's a lot of things I like, is that people give information. They don't hold it back and try to keep it to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But they give information, the training. It's a principle that's like in the DNA of co-ops and this co-op movement, is to give knowledge, give it out freely, so people can make informed decisions and have control over their life, their destinies, their families, and realize their dreams. So I love co-ops for that reason, and it doesn't make any difference if you're male or female, if you're old or young, if you're black or white, gay or straight. It just doesn't make any difference from a communist or this capitalistic model, democratic. It just doesn't make any difference. All of the stereotypes and stigmas that we put on each other for whatever reasons. In the co-op world, it just goes through and transcends all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
David, we only have 2 minutes left. Anything else?
Well, let's see. How wonderful for you to tell me. There is a new book out called Collective Courage.
Mm-hmm.
It is written by Jessica Gordon Nembart. It came out probably about 2 months ago. I don't have any more details that I can give you because the book is by my bedside and I've been reading it and I should have brought it in. But people can go and find that book, and it is it's almost the doomsday book of Black history in America, because she does such fabulous work on looking at almost every example of how Blacks have cooperated in the United States, from the very earliest days of coming over as slaves, through to what is happening in a lot of the inner cities today.
What's the name of it again? Collective
Courage.
Collective Courage.
Yeah, and it's just fabulous. And no matter what I write, it is not going to compare in any way to this particular book for its its studious way of going about it. But anybody reading that book is going to be thrilled to know that Blacks have played a role with cooperative.
Okay, we've got to go. Yeah, thank you so very much, buddy.
Thank you,
really
mate.
Enjoy, and I keep learning. Have a great day. We'll see you next Thursday on Everything Cooperative.
1450 WOL.